What the hell is going on in Brazil? Recently, the Supreme Court handed a 17-year sentence to a pro-Bolsonaro photographer for climbing on a monument during protests prior to Lula taking power. Ever since Lula got into office last year, friends have been telling me that things would go downhill, but I definitely didn't expect it to happen this fast. We have similar elements to what happened in Canada with freezing bank accounts and cracking down on online speech, along with the witch hunt following the January 6th protests. We have that as a justification for expanding this central state power under the regime. I lived in Brazil for 2 years and prior to that for 8 months, so I'm definitely hoping that it doesn't become as bad as it's looking. But right now, Brazil is heading towards being Venezuela, with this unholy alliance between Lula and Moraes.
Boa tarde e bem-vindo. Hello and welcome. So what we have in Brazil is a ridiculous escalation of these leftist governments going after people who don't agree with them. So first of all, regarding Brazil, it is the largest country of South America and the fifth biggest in the world. It stretches around 4,500 miles on its Atlantic coastline and borders every South American country other than Chile and Ecuador. The population of Brazil is 218.68 million, according to the 2023 estimate. I'm taking this from the CIA World Factbook. The ethnicity of Brazil is 45% mixed, 43% Caucasian, 10% Black, and 0.6% Indigenous, 0.4% Asian. So the majority of Brazil is those of mixed race or Caucasian background. There are various religions in Brazil, but the predominant would be Roman Catholic, followed by Evangelical, Spiritist at 3%, Umbanda, Candomblé, and other Afro-Brazilian religions, a small Jewish minority, some atheists, and a very small Muslim population. The population is currently growing at around 0.6%, and it is a federal presidential republic with its capital at Brasilia. In terms of Brazil's main industries, those are clothing and textiles, shoes, chemicals, cement, lumber, iron ore, tin, steel, aircraft production, aircraft parts, motor vehicles, motor vehicle parts, machinery, and various equipment such as agricultural and infrastructure and construction equipment. It mainly exports to China at 28% and the United States at 13% of its export share. And it exports a lot of mainly agriculture and meat. So things like soybeans, sugar, poultry meats like chicken, and a lot of iron, soybeans, and imports a lot of products from China, the United States, and some from Germany and Argentina. Things like refined petroleum, other vehicle parts, and electronics and pesticides. In terms of their money, the Brazilian real, it is worth about 1/5 of the US dollar. So a US dollar is worth about 5.4 reals, or a Canadian dollar is worth about 3.6, 3.7. So Lula assumed power in the first week of January 2023. Actually, the protests on January 8th were around 1 week after he was officially inaugurated. And many people in Brazil leading up to Lula's election were very concerned with the future of the country, not only economically, but in terms of the far left ideologies he was spreading for families. And many Lula supporters I met were very optimistic that he would bring more social equality and help the generally poorer populations of the North. And in the end, I personally felt that nothing very dramatic was likely to happen with Lula. However, it turns out that his regime is escalating the situation quite fast, especially via Alexandre Moraes, who is in the STF, or Supreme Court of Brazil, and is a key progressive ally. What we have in Brazil is a ridiculous escalation of these leftist governments going after people who don't agree with them. I'm reading here from which is a pro-Lula channel. And the headline here is Reo que fez vídeo em cima da torre do Congresso durante atos golpistas está entre os 15 condenados pelo STF. So this means the defendant that made a video on top of the Tower of Congress during the coup gets condemned along with 15 other people by the Supreme Court. The article goes on to say that Wellington Luiz Firmino from Sorocaba, Sao Paulo state, filmed himself on the tower of the National Congress in Brasilia during the quote-unquote invasion of those who did not agree with Lula on the 8th of January. So Firmino is a motorcycle delivery guy from Sao Paulo state who didn't agree with Lula and went to the protests on January 8th of last year at the main government buildings in Brasilia. He was recently handed a sentence of 17 years, 2 of which will be probation or detention at home. The trial ended last Friday, and he was convicted for rising up against the democratic state, trying to do a coup d'etat, and criminal association and damaging state property. Now, this case is absolutely insane because you have the minister Alexandre de Moraes talking about how bad Firmino was and claiming that he was part of this attempt to actually overthrow the entire Brazilian government, and that his taking a video from the top of the tower in the National Congress was some kind of proof that he was taking over the government. Now, the defense for Firmino said that he was just looking around. Clearly, he was a strong supporter of Bolsonaro, but he was celebrating this stance on top of the tower, and the defense disputed the idea that this was an actual military or coup takeover. In any case, he was one of many who are now being sentenced, including journalists and photographers who were there on that day, and people who were friends with him, and those who went to talk about why they did not support Lula and believed that the election had financial and voting corruption involved, which had swung the vote. Firmino's lawyer, Gabriel Tilis, said the entire case had an absence of just cause and not nearly enough evidence to justify the charges. Now, there was apparently no attempt to overthrow the government or violate Brazil's democratic rules. However, he has now been found guilty, so that case has apparently been decided. And he, for himself, said that he is completely innocent and that his only crime was having an opinion. Firmino said he's been working since he was 12 and he is not a criminal. He says drug dealers and murderers have more rights than him in Brazil at this point. He said, "I just exercised my right to raise the flag of my country to the highest point of Brasilia with full permission of the authorities who were there. I did not break absolutely any law. Quite the contrary, I filmed those who were actually doing damage to the public property." In other words, he did not cause the damage. He was filming and showed those who were causing the damage. First, let's start with the obvious similarities here to January 6th in the United States. Now, in that case, you have someone like Ray Epps, who received very strangely low punishment for his role in guiding people inside the Capitol. And you had various violent acts that appear to have obviously been done by agent provocateurs and others who were informants. These kind of political activist movements have people who watch out for those who are doing violent or dramatic things because of the high chance that those people are simply being paid by the government to frame the rest of the crowd. This is not very complicated stuff, although many people still seem to fall for the idea that a crowd of protesters is defined by the worst people among it. In a certain sense, you also saw this during the BLM protests and riots when the actions of certain of the violent individuals were blamed on everyone. But for the most part, this is a province of the political and cultural left, where they will take a large group of people and single out a few of them to then define the entire event. If you look at the huge amount of people who participated in January 6th and the minuscule amount who even did a tiny bit of damage to a window or anything like that. Now, the similarities here between January 6th and January 8th of Brazil, which happened several years later, these similarities are certainly telling. And you see in the aftermath of the January 6th events how John Brennan and other folks like that said the whole powers of the state would have a laser like focus to go after everyone who was remotely involved. You saw families tell on each other. You saw political prisoners put in jail without any basic rights. You saw them not fed properly. You saw the media go into a sort of salivating attack mode on these people as if they were some kind of ultra Nazi fanatics. And in Brazil, the polarization never used to be this bad. But now, with what's happened here, you have someone given more than a decade of conviction for not supporting the government, essentially. You also had frozen financial assets. You have the language of a coup being used in the sense that anything that opposes the current administration is illegal. You also have some other very interesting parallels. Now, Lula himself is 78 years old, and he comes from a background as a labor unionist, as a leftist Workers' Party individual. His party is the PT, or Partido dos Trabalhadores, so the Workers' Party. And similar to Biden, although Biden is clearly a more establishment figure. However, he himself comes from more of a labor unionist background. And I met many older generation or moderate Democrats who supported him initially because they did not understand the new face of the Democrat Party, or were simply in denial over it, or were horrified by something they disliked of Trump or the current Republican Party. However, Biden is run by the vanguard of his party in almost every sense, even on cultural issues and in many ways on economics. And it's the same with Lula, who changed all his formerly more or less socially conservative views into the current vanguard views that you're required to have to be in the modern political left. Both Biden and Lula are not actually representative of a functioning executive and are both being run by large networks of interested parties and corrupt money laundering schemes that essentially turn their countries into giant laundromats for corrupt NGOs, degenerate cultural ideologies, and all sorts of other insanity. Now, at this point, we have people locked up and their bank accounts frozen, the same way that Justin Trudeau did during the trucker protest, basically because they are not with the program. And the program is you believe what we tell you to believe and shut the hell up. In closing, I'm just going to say that Brazilian people are very worried at this point, and they have a reason to be. We have seen what happens in South America. The continent tends to swing far left or far right. However, even the claims that Bolsonaro, who came before Lula, was somehow far right, are very hard to support with his actual governing policies and his actual behavior in office. Nonetheless, you can see how from Colombia with Gustavo Petro and with all these folks taking power across South America who are bringing back a leftist ideology fused with globalism. So this is not your traditional or your old left, it's a new transhuman left. And when you have this all put together, you have the crackdown that's happening, you have ordinary Brazilians basically being criminalized for their opinions. There is a lot to worry about, and folks at the State Department and in the government and people in Europe should be paying attention to what's happening in Brazil, because this is how it starts with a few incursions. You claim that these people are extreme, these people are on the margins, a small fringe minority, right? But eventually that small fringe minority is pretty much everyone other than the ruling cadre. And so if you do what Mao Zedong did and use the peasants and their resentment to turn them against the landlords and then create a rolling momentum of an army of resentment and hatred taking over the country and then call that a workers' revolution, you can claim that this rolling avalanche of prosecutions that's starting to happen and that's only going to get worse is somehow just an isolated occurrence. However, at this point, we've seen enough to know that it's certainly part of a pattern. The Biden DOJ, the Brazilian STF, these powerful deep state organizations working on behalf of a very nefarious goal and locking up anyone who doesn't agree with them. These people are absolutely dangerous. This case of Firmino and his compatriots arrested is just one of hundreds of the shocking cases currently happening in Brazil, with Alexandre de Moraes behind many of them and those who think in his similar vein. So Brazil currently has politicians in jail for saying their opinion. They have journalists exiled to the US whose passports and bank accounts are frozen back in Brazil. They have Bolsonaro being threatened every day. There are social media accounts and YouTube channels simply removed as soon as they go against the government. This is not child's play, it's not over exaggeration, and the situation needs to be called out very fervently, but not in the language of human rights or freedom, because this is not about universal principles. This is about a specific case of one ideology and one side believing that they can do whatever they want to their enemies. And so far, they're being proven correct. So this is the time to tell them to back down. I hope Brazil gets better. I hope to return one day. I love Brazilian people. I love Brazil. I have friends on the left, on the right, in the middle. I have apolitical friends. However, the situation that's unfolding is truly sad and truly shocking. It should make everyone angry. Regardless of the principles, this is about the specific situation with governments who have far too much power for their own good and toxic, distorted individuals like Moraes using their power to force people into this grid system that is going to be terrible for everyone in the end.